Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 20. The first clip showed a bland room made up of a bed and a bare array of medical equipment. The asset sits on the bed, looking out of character in pale gray pajamas. Eyes vacant, unmoving, following his orders, and however unusual, everything in order. The second clip shows a timestamp that places it several weeks later. The lights have dimmed. The asset lies on the bed, covered by a thin sheet. He's shaking, moaning in his sleep, thrashing and turning, nowhere near the quiescent rest that one should be able to expect from the perfect weapon. Still, when a clearly frightened medical technician wakes the asset up, there is no visible change in him, only the habitual stance and vacant eyes. Afterwards, Tony didn't even remember stepping out of the armor amid Jarvis's loud objections, didn't remember putting his hands up or letting himself be taken to a car. Not the ride through Miami or the boat trip that took him out to some oil tanker or other. In some distant corner of his mind, he knew he should be paying more attention, that every detail he took in might prove valuable later, but he couldn't seem to process anything beyond the fact that Jamie was still alive, but still in danger. The constant veering back and forth between panic and relief made it impossible to think, let alone take in any of the things he usually had been able to register without a thought. Made it impossible to care. He wasn't even sure what had happened to his armor. And then Killian was in front of him, and Tony had never felt like this, never felt this all-encompassing, damn near physical need to kill another person. This man had stolen his son, had burnt him out of the iron cradle, had torn the tracker out of his arm, and not carefully, judging by the amount of blood Tony had seen on that chip, had threatened him, never mind if he'd used words or not. The rage, the utter loathing, was so deep and base, it threatened to consume every bit of him. And fuck it. And it was all Tony could do, not to physically jump the man and try to tear his eyes out like an enraged animal.
Mr. Slark, Killian greeted. Kind of you to join us.
At the us, everything came into sharp focus, and Tony found himself scanning the space, anxiously looking for Jamie. Instead, his eyes fell on a familiar woman. It took just a moment for him to place her face, which really was kind of stupid. He should have known she was involved somehow, no matter how unlike her it sounded. Extremis was her baby, after all. Maya, he greeted, the name coming out curt. He turns his attention back to Killian. You absolute asshole! Where is my son?
Safe and sound,
Killian said, and the smile on his face did absolutely nothing to ease Tony's need to pummel his face until even his own mother wouldn't recognize him.
In the other end of the tanker. We need to discuss business. Once we've reached a satisfactory agreement, I'll personally take you to see him.
Tony gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached. Jamie must be frightened, alone in a strange place, surrounded by strangers. Tony ached for him, a physical thing, the pain of it sneaking through his whole body, cutting him, making his throat close up, and his eyes threatened to sting. For a moment, all he wanted was to drop to his knees and beg, promise anything. Everything! If he could only see his son. Pride be damned, principle be damned, stark men are made of iron be damned. All he wanted was to see his son safe, and the rest of the world could go to hell for all he cared. Except, no matter how much he sometimes wished it, Tony wasn't that stupid! He couldn't agree unthinkingly to whatever demands Killian had. He had to think about the consequences, like fucking always. Had to make sure he didn't take part in creating a world he didn't want his son to grow up in. Had to make sure he didn't set them up to be stuck in a situation where they became disposable. Getting to Jamie wasn't enough. It was only the first step. He needed to figure out how to get them out of here as well, and preferably to a world that was still standing. Swallowing around the sudden lump in his throat, he looked up. What business? He asked, voice as smooth as he could possibly get it, with a hint of a croak still clinging to the back of it. Killian turned the floor over to Maya with a flourish that belonged in a public presentation and rubbed Tony entirely the wrong way. Maya at least had the decency to look vaguely uncomfortable when she cleared her throat.
This isn't really the way I'd have preferred to do things, Tony,
she said. He believed her, and he didn't care one bit. No matter how badly she felt about it, he was still here. Jamie was still here, probably frightened out of his mind. Whether or not she felt the pang of conscience, that was still unforgivable. When he didn't respond, she visibly straightened her back, as if finally taking some kind of ownership of the situation.
What we're working on here,
she started. Tony cut her off. Extremis. I'm not a complete idiot. His palms hurt, he realized. It took looking down to find out that he'd been clenching them so hard even his short, blunt fingernails were digging grooves into the calluses on his hands. "So, please tell me, what about that made you think you needed to kidnap an innocent little boy?"
She had the courtesy to flinch. Not that it made much difference.
Tony filed the observation away anyhow. If he encouraged it, the guilt might get bad enough that he could use it. She visibly steeled herself again. "This doesn't have anything to do with James," she said. "I needed you." Tony cocked an eyebrow. He wasn't going to suggest they'd let Jamie go and keep him, not yet. He'd know the moment if it came. This was not it, and he couldn't waste it. "Really doesn't seem like the best situation for flattery, does it?" "It's not flattery," she said. "It's—" She swallowed with a click, and a flash of resentment came over her face, there and gone again so fast he nearly didn't catch it. That wasn't good. "Biotech isn't even your field, but you nearly solved it back in Switzerland. The glitch. You were drunk and playing around, and you nearly solved the riddle I've been working on for the past 20 years in your head. And I'm so close now. Extremis is practically stable. I just need you to finish those equations, Tony." Tony snorted. "Stable," he said. "I'm going to tell you right now that it really isn't. Out on the streets, people are going bang. They're painting the walls, Maya. You're kidding yourself."
A slight tick in her jaw.
"You can help me fix it," she said then. She pulled an old scrap of paper out of her pocket. Some kind of convention name tag, Tony realized. Byrne, signed, "You Know Who I Am." Oh, he definitely had his hands on that at some point, even if it was ancient history. She flipped it over and showed him the writing on the back. Tony cocked an eyebrow. "Did I do that?" he asked. This time she looked almost sad, and screw her emotions. He really didn't give a damn right now. "Yes," she said. Tony shrugged. "I remember the night, not the morning. Is this really what you've been chasing around?" "You don't remember?" she asked, looking downright devastated, and some smidgen of satisfaction ran through Tony at the sight. He did remember. Even if he hadn't, she was practically repeating herself, and seeing the equations in front of him definitely was triggering something. "Can't help you," he said, and there was that look in her eyes. This was the moment, or would have been if Killian hadn't been there. He could get to her, he really could. The relief almost made him stagger despite the anger still flowing through him, and who knew one person could feel so many emotions in one day? Killian stepped in then, literally taking a step forward. For a moment he reminded Tony of Hammer, always trying to make himself bigger, always trying to own the room, always coming up just a little short. Except Tony was starting to think this guy was a hell of a lot more dangerous than Hammer.
"I think it's time you saw your son, Tony," he said. "Maya, why don't you take him?"
Maya gave a jerky nod and led the way out of the room. This time, Tony was more aware, more alert, able to take in the layout of the tanker, commit it to memory, store it so it would be easily available when he needed it. And he would need it. Sure as fuck didn't plan to stay here 1 second longer than he had to. Speaking of, "What happened to you, Maya?" he asked. "You used to have a moral psychology. You used to have ideals. Wanted to help people. Now look at you. Kidnapping innocent children to get what you want. Letting fuck knows how many others become collateral so you can finally make your discovery. I get to spend every day of my life among people who still have their souls." She looked stricken, looked almost guilty. They'd stopped moving at some point, which was no good. They needed to be right by Jamie when she made her choice so that Tony could be out of there with his baby boy in his arms before she inevitably changed her mind. He started walking again, setting a quick pace, and she took the prompt, leading the way onwards. Finally, there was a door, and Maya unlocked and opened it, and inside, sitting on what still looked disturbingly like a hospital cot, was Jamie. Tony's throat went tight, and his knees almost gave out from under him at the relief of it. "Jamie," Tony asked. "Sweetheart." Jamie lifted his face, grimy with tear tracks, eyes too big for his face. "Daddy?" he asked, and then he was across the floor and in Tony's arms, and Tony clutched him as tightly as he dared, kissed the top of his head, hands frantic as they checked the kid over for injuries besides the obvious bandaged wound on his arm. "Daddy, you came!" Jamie whispered. Tony squeezed his eyes shut. "Yeah, buddy," he managed, voice far too thick. "Of course I did." He made himself straighten up, forced his voice back under control. Then he turned so he could meet Maya's eyes over Jamie's shoulder. "Get us out of here," he said. Her eyes flickered with something like fear. He saw the momentary determination in them, felt relief flood him, threatened to steal every last bit of strength he had left. Her mouth opened. "So did the door."
"You know what my old man used to say to me?"
Killian asked, the smile on his face carefree, his body language casual, as though none of this bothered him in the slightest. Tony wanted to kick his teeth in.
One of his favorites of many sayings. The early bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese.
Tony steeled himself, made himself not waste time mourning the window that had opened and closed back up just as fast. "Not still pissed about the Switzerland thing, are you?" he asked, carefully cupping a hand over the back of Jamie's head, shielding his face in the crook of Tony's neck. The less he saw and heard and eventually remembered of all this, the better off he'd be.
How can I be pissed at you, Tony?
Killian asked, still terribly casual, forebodingly so by now.
I wanted to thank you. You gave me the greatest gift that anyone's ever given me. Desperation. If you think back to Switzerland, you said you'd meet me on the rooftop, right? Well, for the first 20 minutes, I actually thought you'd show up. And then the next hour, I considered taking that one-step shortcut to the lobby, if you know what I mean.
Normally, Tony would have deflected, would have tried for humor, something, anything to stay in control of the situation, grasp onto some illusion of superiority. He wasn't going to risk provoking these people, though. Even if the suit was still under his control, and he honestly couldn't remember if he'd made sure to secure it, it would be all the way back in Miami. It wouldn't be here in time to keep them safe if Killian went completely unhinged.
But as I looked down over that city, Killian continued, nobody knew I was there. Nobody could see me. No one was even looking. I had a thought that would guide me for years to come. Anonymity, Tony. Thanks to you, that's been my motto ever since, right? You simply roll from behind the scenes because the second you give evil a face, a Bin Laden, a Gaddafi, a Mandarin, you simply hand people a target.
Tony squeezed his mouth shut, didn't say any of the million things springing to mind. This man was mad, was certifiable. That much was clear, and that probably only made him more dangerous. As much as Tony usually preferred to poke at things until they exploded and he could prepare the remains, with Jamie he had to be careful, so careful. He couldn't lose his son, could not, would not, never. Killian proceeded to go on a ramble about the fake Mandarin, gesturing and intonating as though it was some kind of performance, and Tony gritted his teeth, tried to focus on Jamie's trembling form, on keeping them both calm. They'd get through this, they'd get out, they had to.
Anyway,
Killian said, finally seeming like he was about to wrap up his damn monologue.
Ever since that dude with the hammer fell out of the sky, subtlety's kind of at its day.
He paused, and the expression on his face clearly indicated that he was looking for a response. Tony didn't want to give him anything, but nor could he afford to piss the asshole off. "So what's next for your world?" he asked, teeth gritted so tightly his jaw ached. He couldn't manage more than a monotone, let alone anything that could pass for actual interest. And he knew that was stupid, knew that whatever information he could get, he should grab with both hands and clutch tight. He couldn't make himself care about that, though not until Jamie was out of danger. Couldn't even care about the way his head was going in circles, jumping from one conclusion to the opposite one like a rat in a maze. He was surprised he hadn't lost it yet.
I want to repay you,
Killian said, and Tony felt a cold shiver of foreboding trickle down the back of his neck.
The self-same gift you so graciously imparted to me.
And suddenly Tony was noticing the suitcase in his hands, the syringes lined up inside. The smile on Killian's face was deceptively sane, even as Tony felt terrible, utter, gut-wrenching fear begin to take him over.
Desperation,
Killian said, pulling out a syringe.
You were the kid, Tony.
Tony clutched Jamie all the more tightly, and he was probably hurting him, but he couldn't let go, could barely breathe through fear and rage, and God, who the fuck would even... Killian took a step closer. "Me," Tony said. It came out sounding like a croak. "I'll do it, just..." He swallowed, and he wasn't sure who was shaking the hardest, him or Jamie. Jamie was clutching at him, was mumbling something or other, but Tony couldn't hear him with the rush of blood thrumming through his ears. Tony caught Maya's eyes over Killian's shoulder. She'd gone pale, lips thinning. One hand was hidden behind her back, but she was trembling. No help to be found there.
The boy it is, then,
Killian said with a broad smile.
Thanks, Tony. We've needed a juvenile test subject quite desperately. Need to find out what effects it'll have on a body that's still developing.
He took a step closer, syringe held up. Tony stumbled backwards, felt the wall against his back. They were cornered like fucking animals. Nowhere left to go.